now let us return to the discussions of enonce and enunciation. Benveniste's discussions of enonce and enunciation and ways in which he uses these. And we go back to the focus of Benveniste on Saussure and the fundamental split concerning the realm of subjectivity that Benveniste sees in the Saussurean work. And he tells us that, as we said before, that the relations in a linguistic sign being arbitrary when analyzed, but when they're in use, they become necessary. And this presents a two-way tension in the sign subject. So Benveniste then identifies two sides of the use of language, and he calls these enonce and enunciation. Enonce, he tells us, is a statement or content of a particular instance of language. It's the statement or content. That which is being said. That which is being said is the enonce, according to Benveniste. Enunciation, however, enunciation is the act of utterance and presupposes a speaker and a listener. You cannot have enunciation without the speaker and the listener. You cannot have dance without the dancer and, of course, the audience. Without an audience, there is no dance, even if the audience is the self. Okay, if the audience is the self, then there is a dancer and a danced, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but the audience, the actor and the audience. Same with speech and discourse. If there is a speaker and a spoken to, then we have enunciation, according to Benveniste. And this is how he described the two. Enonce, that which is being said. Enunciation is the act of utterance, including that which is being said, and presupposes a speaker and a listener. So these two ideas, these two notions, these two ideas are recognizable when articulated in these ways, but in practice they're of course always entangled. The dancer and the dance are always one and not separable. So to recontextualize the use of enonce and the use of enunciation, Benveniste tells us that the rendering of the self as a subject becomes represented in the use of pronouns, such as I, and this constitutes a process of enonce. So by using the word I without any context, which is impossible, the process of enonce appears. However, when we notice, when we realize, when we acknowledge the I who does the rendering, then we see the process of enunciation appear. So as we begin to use the pronoun I, we then affect the process of enunciation, but without contextualizing the process and simply producing the term I without context and of course without discourse, then this is simply a case of enonce. Okay, the dilemma then between these two evidences itself in a paradoxical construction of the sentence or the phrase I am lying. If I say that I am lying, then what does this mean? Does this mean that I am lying or not? When I use the sentence I am lying, what am I saying? If I say that you're lying, if I say that he is lying, then it's quite simple. It means that, look, this sentence, this thing that this person told me is wrong. It's not the truth. It's not the truth. However, if I say that I am lying, how can I be lying if I'm expressing that my lie is the truth? Okay, so then am I speaking about myself? Am I speaking? Am I speaking reflexively? And this is how Benveniste actually presented his case, saying, look, I am lying, If this is a simple case of enonce, then no problem. However, if this is a case of enunciation, then we have a problem because I has to be a representation of self. And while it is a representation of self, then it doesn't make sense because I am actually refuting what I'm saying. So the subject has to then separate self from the subject represented in the instance of discourse. Okay, so the I is lying. I am lying. Look at this diagram now. And the top part is the instance of enonce, where we have our circle, the speaker not speaking to anybody. And this is, of course, impossible. It's non-contextual. But at any rate, for our intents and purposes, we present this as a speaker not speaking to anybody, and this is a very simple I without context. It's a non-discursive interpretation of I, and it is non-topothetical. So a case of non-topotheticity, not positioning the I. And in this way, we objectify the speech, and there is a referent only, an artifact, and not a subject, definitely not a signifier nor a signified. If we look at the bottom, we see that the I becomes then signified and becomes a deictic in the sense that there is a you and I am speaking with you and there is a negotiation. So a discursive negotiation. And this is, according to Benveniste, this is the process of enunciation, the act of utterance which presupposes a speaker and a listener. And in this way, we have a subjectification of language through a self-predication of the speaker. So the speaker predicates both self and the other in an act of linguistic negotiation. And in this way, both the I and the you become signified, and the speaker and the listener both deictically realize the discourse. Now remember, we spoke about before that the deixis can occur in a number of different sets of ways, cosmological ways, and these include the spatial, the temporal, and the social-cultural. Okay, moving on to the elements of a sign system, then we can begin to discuss this by noting that signs are ubiquitous. And what does this mean? This means that signs are everywhere. The presence of signs is such that signs are everywhere. Signs are ubiquitous, everywhere. But they condition us, the signs condition us to not know how to limit one sign without altering the sign, the society, individual equilibrium. So we do not know how to alter the sign without altering the cosmological stance, the agency of the individual. So the question then becomes, how do we arrange, configure, and order these signs? How do we arrange, configure, and order these signs and their relationships, of course, because a sign is about its relationships, isn't it? And delimit their sets. Well, so Benveniste had a response to this, and his response was the combination of Saussure and Peirce, which was really the first time that anyone had attempted such a thing, and this was done in 1974, and in 1969 in his Is Homology de la langue. Okay, and in this framework that he presented that language can relate to and distinguish from other semiotic systems, and he articulated the semiotic nature of language, and hence combined Peirce and Saussure. And he formed that Venn diagram, that proverbial Venn diagram, where he looked at the overlap and the non-overlaps and everything, and the worth and the disworth of everything. Okay, so what are the elements of a sign system then? Well, he presented the elements as being internal and external. So for the internal, he said that these internal foreground the irreducible logic of its unity. And I stress the word unity because, when we spoke about Saussure, we spoke about a little while ago, and many weeks ago, we spoke about the fact that Saussure is unity, whereas Peirce is classification. So the internal he broke up into two, the repertoire of signs, and the repertoire of signs is what? The repertoire of signs is predicated on whether signs are iconic, indexical, or symbolic, and how these are combined. However, the other part of the internal system is the functioning of signs. And the functioning of signs when we look at the iconic, symbolic, and indexical aspect of signs, of course, we think of the Peircean description. But the functioning is the glue. The glue, according to Benveniste, is the glue that binds signs into a certain coherency, a certain value and opposition, rules of combination and everything, and that is Saussurean. So he's then speaking about the repertoire and the functioning of signs, and he's saying that these are both parts of the internal system of signs, or the internal aspect of the system of signs. And in this way, he's combining both. Okay, the external part, according to Benveniste, is the foregrounding of the relations of a system to features of the social world. Okay, so initially we had the internal part, now we have the external part. And the external part includes the repertoires of signs, which then becomes the mode. So the audible, the visual, the tactile, and such. The validity of the signs, how valid they become in certain situations. So hence the field of respective signs' social life, and the value of the signs. And the value of the signs, then to discuss the value of the signs, we look at the sign system value related to other systems. Okay, so the value. So we say, okay, well, how much worth do they have in this sign system, and how much worth do they have in another sign system? And then we conduct a comparison of sorts. So for the semiotic system, the internal and external semiotic system, combination of these two to form a semiotic system, we have three requirements. For the internal, first of all, we have a finite property, or a finite repertoire, and this is the finite repertoire of basic signs, which is a lexicon. Another property of the internal part of the system is the rules, or constitutes the rules according to which units combine and form and become larger ones, and this is the syntax and the semantics. So the product of the rules is what Benveniste calls the set of figures, that is, the phrases and sentences. If the lexicon of basic unit is finite, says Benveniste, then the set of figures may be infinite. Okay, so and this makes a lot of sense because we have a lexicon and it is a finite lexicon. However, the combinations become infinite, says Benveniste, because you can combine and combine and combine in an infinite set of ways. And I recall when I was much younger, a friend of mine who was an English teacher had asked me a question, and he said, well, let's write a book. And I said, about what? He said, well, let's write a book about teaching English, or a book for students of English. I said, okay, I am not such a good English teacher. I don't think I could ever do that because English teaching is a great skill and everything. But I can definitely help. And he said, let's start with one word and then increase that to two words. I am drinking, I am going to the bank, and keep extending that until we get all the words in the English language. I said, I was concerned about this because I thought, well, if we open up the dictionary, even if this were possible, I don't think we could fit all that in one book, or cassette or one CD. You know, it would take us probably 10,000 CDs or something to get it all done. And you know, I don't think we have time and resource in our lives to really get this, you know, this infinite or finite but very big set, be it finite. You know. Whether it's finite or infinite, then is a different story. But if it's finite, then it's, you know, a big job. So, you know, my friend soon realized that the impossibility of such an effort and gave up on this, and the book was never done. However, we did both realize that the finite set of elements combined become what is probably an infinite larger set. And according to Benveniste, then this is how it goes. And the external properties, said Benveniste, in the external properties, we see that the system must have a sort of discourse, or a universe of contextualized uses. Let us now look at the last part of what Benveniste tells us, and this is the double significance of language. And after this, we'll move on to the last part of our discussion today. Okay, so the idea of opposition, according to Benveniste, the idea of opposition is such that there is a certain opposition in speech and language. Benveniste here observes that significance is defined by opposition. There is no significance without opposition. And this was Saussurean, right? Saussure told us that to get the significance, to see it, to produce it, there must be an opposition. And here, form and meaning of the sign is restricted by other signs which oppose the sign. Of course, okay, we've seen that, yeah? Opposition, the negative positioning of the sign. The Albania doesn't come Albania until we see France or whatever's next to it, okay? Hungary or whatever. So to get Albania, we need to see Hungary, we need to map the border. Okay, so boundaries are very important, very significant, central to defining the sign. This is what Benveniste said, that Saussure also said was the central part of the sign. And Benveniste tells us that this has two consequences. First of all, he tells us that translational equivalents, so what is translation? Okay, so let's say when we have English and French and we want to translate between English and French, and you know, you need to be very skilled in both to get a good translation, or a quite effective translation. The translational equivalence between the systems in principle is impossible, as the gloss can never be exact. Okay, as the gloss can never be exact, in principle the translation is impossible, and this is where we go back to the idea of affordance, you know, anthropological affordance. Each word has a certain set of affordances, and that way we can match that with any of the affordances of the word in another language and sort of get an approximate connection and get what's going and what's happening. And then when we form the sentence, then all the affordances working together give us a stronger affordance of what the English speaker is trying to say. Okay. The other consequence is, and I quote, two systems could theoretically share sign forms. So if we have two systems, then of course theoretically the sign forms can be shared in a certain way, but these are definitely not equivalent, and this leads on to what we will speak about in a second. Okay, as their respective values are not identical. Okay, so theoretically it works, but you know, but they're never equivalent because the values differ. As soon as we see that the intrasystemic oppositions define meaning, so oppositions within a system actually define meaning, the superficial form of a sign loses its connection to the meaning. And if signs belonging to different systems can never be really seen as the same, then they can be at least partially equivalent. Okay, now I'm going to show you a diagram, and the diagram is, of course, Benveniste's symmetry and asymmetry, and this was central to his work combining Peirce and Saussure. And so he distinguished between the two systems, symmetric and asymmetric. And the symmetric part was the reversible part, because if you have a symmetric set of systems, then of course you turn it around and it's symmetric, and you know that if you look in the mirror and there is something that's exactly like you, then you could jump into the mirror, and that mirror image may jump out, and there'd be, you'd be quite confused because you wouldn't know who is who. But asymmetric, you cannot reverse these because you do not know who is who in the symmetric part, but in an asymmetric part, you do know, because left is not like right, and your left hand is bigger than the right. So if you swap them around, you say, hang on, now the right hand is bigger than the left, so I know that the right hand used to be the left, okay? Or the red and the blue are not the same, and they are asymmetric. So he separated the symmetric aspect into homology and contiguity, and the asymmetric aspect into interpretance and engendering. So we have our symmetric, asymmetric, and we have our symmetric broken up into homology and contiguity, and the asymmetric into interpretance and engendering. So what is homology then? According to Benveniste, homology is where signs have similar origin and function. Okay, so if you have signs across two systems, they have a similar origin and function. And here, the relations of homology are based on a certain Pearson or Peircean iconic resemblance. Okay. Contiguity, however, in a symmetric set of systems, contiguity is when signs have a proximal significance. Okay, proximal, not similar origin and function, but a proximal, very proximal significance. Okay, and what happens here? Well, the contiguity is really the basis of indexicality. So indexicality emerges from this idea of contiguity. Systems co-occur temporally and spatially in one event, and systems co-occur temporally and spatially in one event. So this is what Benveniste told us is contiguity. Asymmetry, however, the irreversible aspect of the two systems, includes interpretance and engendering. Interpretance and engendering. So subsumed under interpretance is the redescribing across sign systems, where we need to redescribe because it is asymmetric. Okay, so for example, if x is the interpretant of y, then y is not necessarily the interpretant of x. Okay, and the second one, engendering. Engendering, the second part, engendering. Engendering is the production of new signs altogether, or what Benveniste labeled as chaining, where one system models a second system. The system X models the system Y. So in the symmetric system, I should add, the signs in the two systems have a corresponding set of shapes, values, or overall patterns, which differs to the case of the asymmetric.